This story is about my experience with the Skinwalker transformation and how I saw it shift with my own eyes. I took a job that seemed too good to be true, a contract to survey a huge piece of land out in the desert. It was a chance to make a lot of money and prove to myself that I could handle anything the wild threw at me. But what I found out there wasn't just wild, it was ancient and impossible. The land had a secret, a terrible truth that lived in the shadows, and by accident, I stumbled right into it. This is the story of what happened that night, the night my understanding of the world was torn apart. It's the story of how a good deal turned into a life sentence of fear. My name is Alex. I'm a land surveyor, or at least I was. At 24, I thought I had the world figured out. My world was one of numbers, of precise measurements and the unshakable laws of physics. I believed in what I could see, touch, and measure. Anything else was just stories, interesting distractions for people who didn't understand how things really worked. That's why the job in New Mexico seemed perfect. A big company needed a desolate piece of high desert surveyed, a vast, empty stretch of land that bordered the Navajo Nation. The pay was incredible, enough to set me up for a couple of years. The catch was the isolation. The nearest town was a tiny, forgotten speck on the map, and the worksite itself was miles from anything. I saw it as a challenge, a test of my self-reliance. I packed my theodolite, my GPS, and my smug, scientific worldview and drove out into the sun-baked emptiness. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Red rock formations stood like ancient bones against a sky so big and blue it felt like it could swallow you whole. But the beauty came with a heavy, oppressive silence. Out there, the only sound was the wind, and it always sounded lonely. There were no birds singing, no bugs buzzing. It was a dead quiet that made you feel small and very, very alone. I set up my base of operations in the only motel in town, a place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that just said motel in sad, buzzing letters. It was cheap, it was run down, and it was my home for the next few weeks. I was arrogant enough to think I was the master of this empty world. I was there to map it, to define its edges and put it on paper. I had no idea that the land was already owned, that something else had already claimed it, and it didn't like strangers. The town had one of everything, one gas station, one diner, and one trading post that sold a mix of groceries, hardware, and Native American crafts. It was there, while buying a week's worth of water and canned food, that I met him. An old Navajo man was sitting on a bench out front, his face a road map of wrinkles carved by a lifetime under the desert sun. He saw the rolled-up survey maps on the passenger seat of my truck. His friendly expression tightened. He got up slowly and walked over, his eyes fixed on the maps. His name was Jonah. He asked what I was doing so far, out in the Cinder Cone Basin. I told him about my job, proud of the important work I was doing. He just nodded, his gaze becoming distant and grave. He pointed a long, bony finger at a specific section of the map, a spot I had marked as a potential area to start. It was distinguished by a small, hand-drawn square that the old county map labeled as an abandoned homestead. "You be careful out there," Jonah said, his voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together, "especially around that old place. That's taboo ground." I gave him a polite, patient smile, the kind of smile a city person gives when they hear local superstitions. "Taboo how?" I asked, genuinely curious about the folklore. He looked away, toward the distant mazes. "There are stories," he said vaguely. "Stories of things that walk there, things that are not what they seem. They wear the skins of others to trick you." I felt a little thrill, like a tourist hearing, a ghost story. I told him it sounded fascinating, and that I appreciated the warning. In my mind, I was already dismissing him. It was just a story, a way for the old generation to explain the unexplainable. I was a modern man. I had science. I had logic. I didn't believe in things that wore the skins of others. As I drove away, I made a mental note. I decided I would definitely check out that spooky old homestead. I thought it would make for a good story to tell my friends back home, a little piece of local color from my desert adventure. I had no idea that I was the one who was about to become a story. My first day on the job was strange. I drove my truck as far as the dirt track would allow, then hiked the rest of the way to my starting point. The work itself was simple, repetitive. Set up the tripod, level the theodolite, take a reading, make a note, move to the next point. But the silence I'd noticed before was even deeper here. It was unnatural. I've worked in remote places before, and there's always a background noise. The hum of insects, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of a lizard in the brush. Here, there was nothing. It was like the entire landscape was holding its breath, waiting. I felt a constant, low-level hum of anxiety that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, a sound finally broke the quiet. It was a pack of coyotes, their yips and howls echoing from a nearby ridge. But something was wrong with the sound. It wasn't the random, chaotic chatter of a wild pack. Their cries sounded coordinated, almost intelligent. They rose and fell in a pattern, a cadence that felt like laughter. It was mocking, and it seemed to follow me as I moved along the survey line, packing up my equipment. Every time I stopped, the yipping would pause, and when I started walking again, it would resume, always seeming to come from just over the next rise. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was personifying a bunch of dumb animals. But the feeling of being ridiculed, of being the butt of some cosmic joke, stuck with me. I packed my gear a little faster than usual, my heart beating a little too hard. The feeling of being watched was starting to crawl under my skin, and for the first time, I felt a prickle of genuine fear that my logic couldn't explain away. I was glad to get back to my truck, to the solid, man-made certainty of its engine and steel frame. But even as I drove away, I felt like the empty landscape was still watching me go. On the second day, the feeling was worse. It wasn't just a vague sense of unease anymore. It was a physical sensation. It felt like a pressure on the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know, without a doubt, that someone is staring at you. I kept stopping my work, pulling the theodolite off its tripod and using its powerful lens to scan the horizon. I swept across the vast emptiness, from the gnarled juniper trees that dotted the landscape to the shimmering heat haze rising from the desert floor. I saw nothing, no people, no animals, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling persisted. It was a constant, unnerving weight. Later that afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made the first real crack appear in my wall of skepticism. Near one of my survey markers, I found a set of tracks in the hard, sun-baked dirt. At first glance, they looked canine. Coyote, I thought. But as I looked closer, I realized something was deeply wrong. The prints were too big for a coyote, closer to the size of a large wolf. But it wasn't the size that bothered me. It was the gait. The distance between the prints was too long, too regular. It wasn't the trotting, wandering pattern of a wild animal. It was deliberate, as if whatever made them was walking with a specific purpose. I followed the tracks for about 50 yards. They led straight toward a sheer rock face, a 20-foot wall of solid stone. And then they just stopped. They didn't turn. They didn't scatter. They just ended, as if the creature had walked up to the rock and simply vanished into it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last print and then at the blank wall of stone. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the wind had blown the other tracks away. Maybe a rock slide had covered them. Maybe it was just a trick of erosion and light. But none of my explanations felt right. They felt like lies. I was telling myself to stay sane. For the first time on that job, I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a feeling. Here was the proof. Something was out there with me, and it could do things that didn't make sense. My GPS had been acting up all day, the signal flickering in and out. As the sun began to cast long, distorted shadows across the desert floor, it finally died completely. I was tired, frustrated, and a little spooked. My truck was a couple of miles away, and the direct route back was through a rough patch of terrain I'd been avoiding. But the alternative was a long, roundabout hike in the failing light. Cursing my luck and the faulty equipment, I made a decision. I would take the shortcut. I didn't realize until I was halfway through a dense thicket of greasewood that my shortcut was leading me directly toward the area Jonah had warned me about. The old abandoned homestead. I saw the property line ahead of me, a sagging, rusted line of barbed wire fence, its posts leaning at tired angles. It felt like crossing a threshold. The moment I pushed the wire down with my boot and stepped over it, the world changed. It wasn't a dramatic, booming shift, but a subtle, chilling one. The air, which had been warm from the day's heat, grew noticeably colder. It was a damp, cellar-like cold that had no business being in the middle of the desert. I pulled my phone from my pocket, hoping to use its compass. It had been holding on to a single, precious bar of service all day. Now it was completely dead. The screen was black and it wouldn't turn on. I was officially lost, officially without communication, and officially a trespasser. I had ignored the old man's warning, blinded by my own arrogance, and now I was standing on what he called taboo ground. The oppressive silence I'd felt before was nothing compared to the silence here. This quiet was heavy, ancient, and filled with a silent, waiting malevolence. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I had just made the worst mistake of my life. I was no longer just a surveyor on a job. I was an intruder in a place that did not want me there. Now I was truly lost, deep inside the forbidden zone Jonah had warned me about. The last light of the sun had bled from the sky, leaving behind a deep purple dusk that swallowed details and turned familiar shapes into monstrous silhouettes. It was in this disorienting twilight that I heard it, a new sound cutting through the heavy silence. It was the faint, unmistakable cry of a baby. It was a thin, wailing sound, full of distress and pain, and it was completely, terrifyingly out of place. There were no houses for miles. No one would bring an infant out to this desolate, dangerous place. My mind started racing, trying to process the impossibility. My rational brain, the part of me that was still clinging to sanity, was screaming, "It's a trap! It's a trick! Animals can make strange sounds. Mountain lions are known to sound like a crying woman or child. It's a recording maybe, set up by some sick prankster." But another, deeper part of me, a primal, protective instinct I didn't know I had, responded to the sound. The cries were so helpless, so real. What if it wasn't a trick? What if a child was really out here, lost and hurt? I couldn't just walk away. The sound pulled at me, a hook in my soul. Against all my better judgment, I started moving toward it. I pushed through thorny bushes and over rocky ground, my eyes fixed on the skeletal shape that was slowly emerging from the gloom ahead. It was the abandoned homestead. The crying was coming from there. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground was trying to hold me back. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, and a strange, misguided sense of duty. I was walking into the heart of the place I had been warned to avoid, drawn in by a sound that promised either a rescue or my own damnation. I moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The homestead was a wreck. The main cabin sagged in the middle, its roof bowed like a tired old back. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out into the desert. The crying sound was clearer now, definitely coming from inside the cabin. The front door hung open on a single rusted hinge, a dark mouth yawning into the blackness within. It was a clear invitation into a place I knew I shouldn't go. As I got closer, a smell hit me. It was thick and foul, a mixture of old dust, dry rot, and something else. It was a sharp, cobbery scent mixed with a musky animal odor. It was the smell of a predator's den, the smell of blood and wildness. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. The crying continued, a desperate sobbing sound that echoed from the cabin's dark interior. My logical mind was at war with my instincts. I decided not to walk through the open door. Instead, I crept around to the side of the cabin, to a window that was mostly intact, covered in a thick layer of grime. I wiped a small patch clean with my sleeve and peered inside. The last bit of twilight filtering through the dusty air showed a single, empty room. The floor was littered with debris and rat droppings, and in the center of the room, huddled in a pile of what looked like old rags, was not a baby. It was a coyote. A huge, mangy-looking animal, its fur patchy and matted. Its whole body was heaving with the effort of making the crying sound. As my shadow fell through the window, its head snapped up. It saw me, and the moment its eyes locked onto mine, the sound of the crying baby stopped instantly. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise had been. I was frozen. My brain couldn't connect what my eyes were seeing with what my ears had just heard. A coyote, crying like a human baby. It was impossible, and yet it was happening right in front of me. I stood there, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and complete disbelief, my hand still pressed against the cold, grimy glass of the window. The coyote in the center of the room didn't run. It didn't snarl or bark. It just stared at me. Then it began to move. It got to its feet, but not like any animal I had ever seen. There was no natural grace, no fluid motion. It rose with a stiff, unnatural deliberation, as if its limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. Its movements were jerky and wrong. It stretched its back, but it arched way too far, a sickening bow that looked like its spine should have snapped. Then it stretched its front legs, and I heard a series of loud, distinct popping sounds, like knuckles cracking, but 100 times louder. It was the sound of joints being forced into positions they were never meant to go. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. I was a spectator at a grotesque performance I couldn't look away from. The head swiveled around and around and around, a full 180 degrees, its shoulders staying perfectly still. Its neck must have broken, but it didn't. It just turned. And in the growing darkness of the cabin, its eyes began to glow. It wasn't a reflection from my flashlight, which was off. It was a soft internal light, a sickening phosphorescent yellow that pulsed with a life of its own. It was looking right at me, and I knew it was not an animal. My body was locked in place, but my mind was screaming. I was a witness to something forbidden, something that defied every law of nature I held dear. The transformation began with a sound. It was a low, wet tearing noise, like thick canvas being ripped apart slowly. It was followed immediately by the sickening crack and grind of bone. I could see the creature's form beginning to change. Its back began to elongate, the spine visibly contorting under the skin. It pushed upwards, lengthening with a series of sharp, percussive snaps that echoed in the dead silent cabin. One after another, pop, 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 like a string of firecrackers going off inside its body. The sound was horrifying, but what came next was worse. A choked whimper escaped the creature's throat. It was a sound of pure, unimaginable agony, the sound of a body being ripped apart from the inside. But as the transformation continued, the whimper of pain began to change. It deepened, roughening into a guttural, strained noise. It was the sound of effort, of a terrible, focused will. It was the sound of a human gasping for breath while lifting something impossibly heavy. The animal sounds were fading, being replaced by something horribly familiar. It was the sound of a man in torment. I could hear the wet, slurping sounds of muscles shifting and reattaching, the dry, rasping sound of skin stretching past its limits. The air grew thick with the coppery smell of blood and something else, something acrid and burnt. Every crack of bone, every wet tear was a chisel chipping away at my sanity. I was watching a living thing being deconstructed and rebuilt right in front of my eyes, and the sounds it made were the sounds of hell itself. The sight was even worse than the sound. I watched, my eyes wide with a horror so profound it felt like a physical blow. The flesh of the creature rippled and undulated like water boiling under its skin. The mangy coyote fur began to recede, not by falling out, but by pulling back into the skin itself, disappearing into the pale, stretched flesh that was emerging underneath. Patches of sickly white skin appeared on its back and flanks, glistening and raw. The creature's face was the focus of the ghastly change. Its long snout began to shorten, collapsing in on itself with a series of soft, crunching sounds. The bones of its jaw cracked and reformed, broadening and flattening. Its sharp canine teeth seemed to shrink, blunting into something more like human molars. The most horrific part was its paws. The creature lifted one of its front paws, and I saw the pads split open. From within the bloody flesh, long, pale, spindly fingers burst forth, coated in a clear, slimy fluid. They twitched and flexed, reaching for the air. All the while the sounds continued their symphony of terror, the wet squelch of muscle finding new anchor points on a shifting skeleton. The dry, rustling whisper of the coyote pelt peeling back from the emerging body, not like a shed skin, but like a grotesque garment being pushed aside from within. And beneath it all, a new sound started. It was a faint, rhythmic, guttural chant coming from deep within the thing's throat. It was a string of syllables I didn't recognize, repeated over and over. It wasn't a sound of pain anymore. It was a sound of power, a sound of ritual. I wasn't just watching a random mutation. I was witnessing a ceremony. The transformation was over in less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Where the coyote had been, something else now stood. It was tall, at least a foot taller than me, but it was unnaturally thin, stooped, and emaciated. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched tight over a frame that seemed all wrong. Its limbs were too long, the arms hanging down almost to its knees, the legs bent at an awkward, bird-like angle. Its joints moved with a sickening flexibility, bending in ways no human or animal should be able to. It was naked, but it wasn't completely bare. The coyote pelt, the skin it had just shed, was still attached at the shoulders, draped over its back like a horrific, still warm shawl. The thing straightened up, its long, spindly body unfolding from its crouch. It turned its head, and for a single, heart-stopping second, I saw its face. It was a nightmare mask of humanity. The features were distorted and stretched, a cruel parody of a human face. The nose was flat, the mouth a wide, lipless slit, but the eyes were the same. They were the same malevolent, glowing, yellow orbs that had stared at me from the coyote's head, and they were filled with an ancient, intelligent hatred. It knew I was there. It knew I had watched its most private, sacred, and terrible ritual. In that moment I understood the warning from Jonah. This was a thing that wore the skin of others, and I had just seen it change its clothes. The spell of frozen terror finally broke. A single thought cut through the fog in my brain. R-U-N. I didn't think, I just acted. I spun away from the window and scrambled blindly into the darkness. I crashed through thorny bushes that tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't feel the pain. All I could hear was the frantic, panic sound of my own breathing and another sound, much, much worse. Behind me, I could hear the thing pursuing me. It wasn't the four-legged scrabble of a coyote. It was the heavy, loping, two-legged footfall of something impossibly fast. It crashed through the undergrowth with a speed that defied its gaunt, awkward frame. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't bear to see that thing again. But the sounds of the chase were all around me. I could hear its heavy, rhythmic breathing, a dry, rasping sound. And carried on the cold night wind, I heard a whisper. It was a low, chittering sound, a mix of animal clicks and human-like syllables, the same chanting I had heard during the transformation. It was whispering its magic as it ran me down. I sprinted with a strength born of pure terror. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't slow down. My expensive surveying equipment, the tools of my once logical trade, lay forgotten back on the ridge. My tripod, my theodolite, all the instruments I had used to measure and define the world, were meaningless now. They were relics from a life I no longer lived, from a reality that no longer existed. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and the nightmare that was hunting me through the dark. I burst out of the dense brush and into a clearing where I had left my truck. The moonlight reflected off its windshield, a beacon of hope in the terrifying darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp them. The sound of the loping pursuit was getting closer, the whispering chant growing louder. I could feel it just yards behind me in the trees. I finally got the key in the lock, wrenched the door open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't even bother with the seatbelt. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life with a sound that was sweeter than any music I had ever heard. I slammed the truck into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun in the loose dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust and rocks before they finally caught traction. The truck lurched forward, and I peeled out onto the dirt track, heading away from that cursed homestead as fast as I could. As I straightened out the wheel, my eyes flickered to the rearview mirror out of a morbid, horrified instinct. And I saw it. Standing at the very edge of the woods, silhouetted perfectly against the rising moon, was the tall, gaunt figure. It stood perfectly still, watching me go. Then, it slowly raised one of its long, spindly arms. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a threat. It was something else, a gesture of acknowledgement, a promise. It was telling me that this was not over. Then, as if it were made of shadow itself, it turned and melted back into the darkness of the woods, disappearing completely. I kept my foot pressed to the floor, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't look back again. When I finally got back to the rundown motel, I was no longer the same person who had left that morning. The arrogant, skeptical surveyor was gone, shattered into a million pieces. In his place was a trembling, hollowed-out shell of a man. I stumbled into my room and slammed the door, fumbling with the lock, the deadbolt, and the chain. Then I dragged the cheap particle board desk and a chair in front of the door, barricading myself in. But I knew it was useless. A wooden door couldn't protect me from what I had seen. The rational part of my brain, the part that had always been in control, had been completely erased. It was replaced by the visceral, undeniable memory of what I had witnessed, the sound of cracking bone, the sight of flesh reforming, the glowing yellow eyes. Those images were burned into my mind, playing on a loop I couldn't turn off. I spent the entire night huddled in the corner of the room, clutching a tire iron I'd grabbed from my truck. Every sound was a threat. The scrape of a tree branch against the window was the claw of the creature. The howl of the wind was its whispering chant. The groan of the building's old pipes was the sound of its unnatural joints popping. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing that distorted, inhuman face. The world was no longer a safe, predictable place governed by the laws of physics I once trusted. It was a place of dark magic, of ancient horrors that could wear the skin of a coyote and hunt you in the night. I had seen behind the curtain of reality, and what I saw had broken me. There was no safety, not in a locked room, not anywhere. The monster was out there, and it knew I had seen it. I didn't sleep at all. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the dirty motel window, I was still huddled in the corner, exhausted and raw with terror. The world outside looked normal. Cars drove by, the sun was rising, but I knew it was all a lie. The real world was the one I had seen last night. After a few hours of staring at the wall, I forced myself to move. I needed to think, to make a plan. I unbarricaded the door, my heart pounding with every piece of furniture I moved. When I finally opened it to the pale morning light, my blood ran cold. There, on the cheap, worn-out doormat outside my room, was a single, muddy footprint. It was a perfect canine print, but it was huge, far too large for any dog. It was the same size as the tracks I had seen in the desert. The mud was still damp. It had been here. It had stood right outside my door while I cowered inside. The horror wasn't confined to that abandoned homestead. It had followed me back to town. Later that day, I forced myself to get in my truck. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move. I was driving erratically through the small town, my eyes darting everywhere, when I saw it. On the shoulder of the main road, there was a dead coyote. That wasn't unusual in this part of the country. But this one, its body was twisted into a horribly familiar position. Its back was arched too far, its limbs stretched at impossible angles. It was the exact same unnatural posture the creature had held in the cabin, right before it began to shift. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a warning, a reminder. It was telling me that it knew where I was, that it could find me anywhere, and that I could not escape the knowledge of what it was. I was coming apart. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't eat. Every shadow looked like the gaunt figure from the woods. Every dog bark sounded like the beginning of that horrible chant. I was on the verge of a complete mental breakdown, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. There was only one person in the entire world I could talk to, only one person who might understand. In a state of pure desperation, I drove back to the trading post. Jonah was there, sitting on the same bench as before, as if he had been waiting for me. He took one look at my face, at my pale skin, my wild, haunted eyes, and the deep, dark circles underneath them. He knew. He didn't look surprised, he just looked sad, his ancient eyes filled with a deep pity. He nodded his head slowly, a gesture of grim understanding. Before I could even open my mouth to stammer out my story, he spoke, his voice low and certain. "You saw it," he said. "It wasn't a question. You went to that place. You weren't supposed to see. All the fear, the horror, and the loneliness of the past 2 days came crashing down on me. The dam broke. I, Alex, the former skeptic, the man of science and logic, broke down completely. I started sobbing right there in the dusty parking lot of the trading post. The words tumbled out of me, frantic, incoherent mess. I begged him for help. I was no longer an arrogant outsider scoffing at local folklore. I was a believer, and I was desperate. Jonah listened patiently to my rambling, terrified story. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his expression growing more grave with every detail I shared. When I was finished, exhausted and empty, he led me to a quiet spot behind the trading post, away from any prying eyes. He explained what little he could, his voice a low whisper. "You saw an Ayi Naldlushii," he said, the strange words sounding ancient and heavy. "In your language, a Skinwalker. He told me they were not myths or legends. They were real. They were people, medicine men and women who had chosen a dark path, a perversion of the sacred healing arts, to gain their power. The ability to change form, to move with unnatural speed, to curse their enemies. They had to commit unspeakable acts, breaking the most profound taboos of their people. The transformation," Jonah explained, his eyes dark with the weight of the knowledge, "is their most sacred and secret ceremony. It is not meant for outside eyes. By witnessing it, you did more than just see something you shouldn't have. You insulted it. You shamed it." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a random monster, it was a witch, and I had crashed its private ritual. It is tied to you now, Jonah continued. It is drawn to your fear. It is drawn to your knowledge of its secret. It will not leave you alone. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small deerskin bundle. He pressed it into my shaking hand. This is sacred corn pollen and blessed ash. It offers some protection. It can create a barrier, but it is not a weapon. It will not kill it. He looked me straight in the eye. There is only one true escape. You must leave this land, go far away to a place with many people, a place of steel and noise, and you must never, ever speak its name or tell anyone what you saw, not unless they already know. To speak of it is to call to it. I took Jonah's words as gospel. I threw all my belongings into my truck in a frantic rush, not even bothering to fold my clothes. My only plan was to wait for the first light of dawn and then drive east until I ran out of road. I barricaded the door to my motel room again, but this time I also took Jonah's advice. I sprinkled a thin line of the sacred ash and corn pollen across the threshold of the door and on the windowsill. That night, the creature came for me. The siege was its final terrifying performance. It began subtly. A soft tapping on the window. It wasn't random. It was a rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. It was the same rhythm as the guttural chant I had heard in the cabin. It was a deliberate, taunting reminder. I sat on the bed, clutching the little pouch Jonah had given me, my heart hammering. Then the attack escalated. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sharp, distinct sound of claws scraping against the wooden door. Long, slow drags, like a knife being sharpened on a stone. Scray-a-abe, scray-a-abe. It wanted me to know it was there. It wanted me to know it could get in. Then came the worst part, the mimicry. I heard a voice outside the door, a whisper that slid through the cracks. "Alex, honey, are you okay? Let me in." It was my mother's voice. A perfect imitation. My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. It was stealing the voice of the person I loved most in the world, twisting it into a weapon. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth, chanting, "It's not real, it's not real." The thing outside the door seemed to feed on my terror. The sounds changed again. The scraping stopped, and I heard an awful, wet shifting sound, the noise of its body changing form right outside my room. The small scratching sounds were replaced by a heavy, dull nump against the wall, as if something huge had just leaned against it. Then another nump and another. It was circling the room, a great, heavy beast, testing the walls, letting me know there was nowhere to hide. The assault continued for what felt like years. The thumping, the scraping, the horrible whispers in voices it stole from my memories. But it never crossed the line of ash. As the sky outside began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple, the sounds stopped. An eerie silence fell over the motel. This was my chance. I knew it wouldn't, or couldn't, follow me into the full light of day. During that pre-dawn lull, I made a break for it. I grabbed my keys and the pouch of ash, my only two treasures in the world. I took a deep breath, unbarricaded the door, and sprinted. The cold morning air hit my face as I ran across the empty parking lot toward my truck. The world was quiet still. For a second I thought I had made it. I jumped into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. Just as the engine turned over, a brilliant flash of lightning from a distant, unseen storm lit up the entire parking lot for a split second, turning night into day. And in that flash, I saw it. The creature was there. It wasn't on the ground. It was standing on the roof of the adjacent motel room, perched like a gargoyle. Its form was a nightmarish silhouette, a twisted mockery of a man, its long limbs bent at sharp angles, the tattered coyote pelt hanging from its stooped shoulders. It was looking right at me, its glowing yellow eyes locked with mine one last time. They were filled with an ancient, bottomless hatred, the hatred of a secret being exposed. I didn't wait for a second look. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal. I drove east, straight into the rising sun, and I did not look back. Months have passed. I live in a city now, a place so big and loud and crowded that it feels like another planet. I am hundreds of miles away from the New Mexico desert, but I am a prisoner. The Skinwalker isn't hunting me anymore, but I am not free. I suffer from a crippling paranoia. I can't be in a quiet room. I can't stand near a window after dark. Every night I relive the sound of cracking bones and the sight of that glowing-eyed face. I have insomnia so bad that I sometimes go for days without sleeping. I lost my job, of course. My hands shake too much to hold a surveying instrument steady. I lost my friends because they couldn't understand why I had changed, why I was so jumpy and withdrawn. They think I had a breakdown. How could I tell them the truth? I am writing this all down, this true story, as a desperate confession. Jonah told me not to speak of it, but the silence is killing me. Maybe getting it out, putting it into words, will lessen the horror that lives inside my head. But I don't think it will. I've come to a terrible conclusion. That night, in that dilapidated cabin, the Skinwalker didn't just transform its own body. It transformed my entire reality. It ripped away the comfortable, logical world I knew and showed me the terrifying, magical, malevolent truth that hides just beneath the surface. My life is a sentence, a constant state of looking over my shoulder. The unspoken burden is that I know the monsters are real. I'm writing this in my small third-floor apartment. The sun has set. Just now, I heard a dog barking on the street below, and I froze. My heart is pounding in my chest, and my hands are starting to shake again. Because for a single, terrifying moment, the bark didn't sound like a dog. It sounded just a little too human.